So, welcome everyone. I was very, excited and thrilled to have this introduction and to do this kind of conversation because this is something that, as an organization at Center for Sexuality, we've been talking about a lot recently. And so to get this invitation, I was like, this is a very timely presentation to give. So a lot of what I'm going to share is some of the wisdom that I have collected from other people who work at Center for Sexuality, and some of it my own, and hopefully people find it helpful today. So we're going to talk about that sexuality and relationship education in today's climate and how there are some challenges, but we have some potential solutions for folks to try out. Daenerys did a great land acknowledgement, but at Center for Sexuality, we like to do our own always as well, ground ourselves in the land and the work that we do. And so I find this really important that we participate in kind of meaning making when we're acknowledging the land. And something that I am reflecting on is my very westernized understandings of sexuality, ones that have held dominance on this land since colonization. The power imbalance and polarization of beliefs that we're seeing today around gender and sexuality on Turtle Island is, I think, merely a reflection of this kind of long history of hegemonic dominance of Western perspectives and thinking. And this is something that I share with a lot of the youth that I teach in my groups, is that Indigenous communities have specific understandings of like two-spirit identities of gender, sexuality that operate outside of the Western cultural beliefs that have held dominance. So it is important to recognize that the beliefs that we have are not the only ones and not the best ones. So I would like to acknowledge that this session is occurring on the territory of the Niitsitapi or Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. So this is where I am situated. And we recognize the Treaty 7 nations who make their home on this land, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Îyârhe Nakoda First Nations, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. And we are grateful to the people of Treaty 7 for taking such good care of this land. And we recognize that we are all treaty people. All right, so just a little bit about Center for Sexuality for those of you who may not know us. We are an organization located in Calgary, Alberta, and we teach, train, and advocate to support healthy bodies, healthy relationships, and healthy communities with the hope that we achieve sexual well-being for all. We do this through a number of different programs like relationship and sexual health education for grade 7 through to high school. So that's a program I'm currently training new facilitators in. We also have our Girls Program and Wise Guys programs, which are year-long gender and age-specific programs for youth. We have a community engagement team, which includes counseling and Men Who Have Sex with Men kind of health programs. And then we also have our training center, which works with professionals like teachers, nurses, all of those folks that want to learn more about equality in their workplace. And this is where we're located in downtown Calgary. We are open kind of 9 to 5, but if people want to get into contact with us, you can always email me. We can put in my email at the end or contact us through our phone or general email that is located on our website. So that's just some about Center for Sexuality. I'm here for any questions if people have other ones. As we move forward through this presentation today, we always do learners' rights at Center for Sexuality. And I want people to engage with this conversation as best they can. So if you want to put questions in the chat, I will try and look at that, but mostly we will do the share and solve at the end. I also want people to take care of themselves if they need to. I know that some of these conversations, especially if we've had really negative experiences in classrooms, might be difficult to unpack. And so if people need to take a break at any time, please do that. We also have our right to privacy. So my portion will be recorded, but the rest will not be. So we are maintaining privacy in that sense. But please take any fun learnings that you take from this presentation and share those with everyone. I would love that. Showing respect. I think we're probably all really good at that here. But I just want to do a reminder that these conversations are difficult. We are constantly in spaces that maybe feel hostile to these beliefs. So we don't always show up perfectly in spaces that are not, warm and welcoming. And so if people want to share experiences where they did something terrible, they were like, this was not my best moment, it is totally okay. We're going to show respect for those experiences because that happens. And it's great for us all to learn from that as well. And last, I hope we have some fun in this conversation today, because why do we do this work if it's not fun, if it's not interesting and exciting? So let's get into it with those learners' rights in mind. On the agenda for today, we are going to think about some of those facilitation challenges that we've encountered in today's climate. I'm going to share some helpful considerations and techniques that have been working for me in classrooms and spaces, talking about these conversations. And at the end, we will have time for a little bit of a share and solve. So moving into it, we have the facilitation challenges that we've noticed at Center for Sexuality. I've listed a few here. I'm sure there's many more. And so if people want to start thinking about some of the challenges that you've noticed that I might not outline, that would be fantastic. So when I'm thinking about this role that I've just begun, I think I do have a bit of a helpful perspective in this conversation, in that I used to do relationship and sexual health education, and then I stopped. I went to girls program, which is a very different, grade 4 girls, they're lovely. They're just happy to have you pay attention to them, and that's great. But when you're in other spaces, it's not as warm and welcoming. And so coming back to relationship and sexual health education in the classroom across Calgary and outside of Calgary, I had about a 4-year break. And so I have this perspective of what it was before COVID, and I'm coming back into it post-COVID. So I'm seeing a lot of differences, and I'm going to share some of those. So we've seen a huge increase in some homophobic, transphobic, racist comments in class or in the question box. So I'm not sure how many people do question box or have done sexual health education, but putting in anonymous questions and then we answer them the next following day. So for example, we see a lot around there's only 2 genders, but usually phrased a little bit more aggressively than that, or a lot of conversations around masculinity, around being an alpha or a sigma, is a very common thing that's coming up with the youth these days. And a lot of this does relate to kind of social media, and we'll talk about that. We've also seen an uptick in a lack of support being shown from teaching staff and in our school partners. So a lot of school staff bringing their own values into the space, potentially wandering off, not supporting classroom management, a tendency to overshare. These things are happening in the classroom pretty frequently. This was actually the catalyst for us to design a teacher training video that we send out to our school partners beforehand. And even though I'm not going to talk about this much further, I do believe partnership management is another key piece of making a conducive atmosphere to facilitation. So letting teachers or support staff know about our expectations before programming, and that's improved our experiences drastically. But we have noticed that teachers, I think, are just overwhelmed, and it's showing up in that partnership management. We've also noticed a larger portions of students are being opted out from sexual health education by their parents. So we've been in some spaces where about a quarter of the class has opted out of sexual health education, whereas before it would be 1 or 2. So a large increase there. We've also lost some partnerships with school boards or schools if certain subjects are addressed too deeply, like gender diversity in particular. So if our facilitator focuses on gender diversity, there is either pushback from parents or teachers, and in some cases, that has ended those relationships. And then overall, I've noticed that spaces seem increasingly polarized. So as if that there isn't room for us to have different values and beliefs. So students seem really super quick to shame or judge each other, as well as the facilitator. And this is anecdotal. It is also my experience in classrooms in Calgary and surrounding area. So of course, people might have noticed different things in their political, social contexts. And it's also colored by my positionality. So the way I show up in a space because of my identity, my personality, all of these things, that definitely changes maybe what people are experiencing. But I think across the board at Center for Sexuality, everyone's noticed this, from parents to teachers to students. There is less room for holding space for others' beliefs that are different from our own. And I think this is often reflected in social media and the way social media has gone too. I want to kind of talk about just very quickly what I believe today's climate is influenced by. This, of course, is not backed by tons of research. I've done some research, I guess, looking at research to think about maybe what are some of the causes for this polarization, for some of this hate that we are experiencing in these classrooms. And so a few things come to mind around the COVID lockdown. And it did definitely reduce children's time in school for years. And during that time, they didn't participate in social and emotional learning, or SEL, which are key competencies that help youth have healthy relationships. And I think that this is something I'm seeing in classrooms, where classroom management has become so much more difficult, where students will just blurt out things, very angry things. They haven't practiced some of these skills, like healthy relationship skills, and it's very noticeable in the classroom. So they have trouble demonstrating curiosity and respect and all of those things that we would hope to see in youth for each other and for ourselves as well as facilitators. And then during this time, and this is also backed by research, we're seeing that there has been an increase in some of the learning, the behavioral disorders or disabilities or delays or any of the words that people want to use in youth as a result of the lockdowns. And then during this time, students were also at home with their parents. And I think that there was some increased surveillance, potentially control over what children were learning. They were able to see this more so. And then in September, kind of following suit, we saw, especially in Alberta, the rise of the parental rights movement. And I think this was across the country, where there was the 1 Million March for Children, which was protesting against gender and sexuality diversity education, or gender ideology and brainwashing in classrooms. So teaching that before the age of 18 was seen as sexualizing children and brainwashing them. And so parents were protesting against schools being able to share this sort of education. And then I want to note that, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation so far, today's media climate has exacerbated both of these influences. So children have had increased access to the internet, increased their consumption during the lockdown, and this has resulted in increased bullying, harassment, non-consensual sending of images. It's also platformed a lot of harmful messages. So for example, TikTok and Instagram algorithms, they do reinforce a person's feed with like-minded content. So we know that this happens. The more you click on something, the more we'll see it. And so we have seen a rise in different media figures, influencers, things like that, that spread very specific images on what it means to be masculine, for example. So people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, we're seeing that their messages are being popularized and algorithms are feeding into kind of this fear that men or other people are under attack. And so we need to push back and get defensive against any change in beliefs that support gender, diversity, sexual orientation, things like that. So we're seeing this increasing polarization around these topics and an inability to hold space for other perspectives or identities. So leading into some helpful tips for relationship and sexual health education. This can also go for much of the gender-based violence kind of prevention work that people do. So I have a few tips here. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then we'll move into the share and solve. So this first one here is ethical facilitation. So this is more my framework of how I think about facilitation in my role. So I think about Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and I don't know who here, show of hands, who's familiar? A few people, amazing. So he helps take a philosophical kind of approach to education, recognizing that oppression can be perpetuated by the banking model of teaching. So where the teacher is the expert, deposits information into the student who's an empty receptacle, who has no power or knowledge or anything. And so it's the teacher to the student, and it is kind of that brainwashing, oppressive passing of knowledge. And this idea is, I don't want to repeat that. I'm not here to oppressively enforce my values and beliefs about the world on youth. I'm not going to change everyone's minds and make them think the way I think. I need to recognize that in a space I might be an outsider in my beliefs. That's actually okay. Facilitation is about sharing information and beliefs, but also helping everyone else in that space do the same and equalize that sharing of space. Truly believing in the sense that we're all equal in that space and we have the right to believe different things and share them. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we don't want to do that. But it is, if we believe that they should listen to us, we should also be listening to them. This values lens next is something that Center for Sexuality does a very fantastic job in their programming. It's an important framework for decision-making that begins with personal values and beliefs. So we let everyone make their own decisions based on their values. We don't tell anyone that they are right or wrong, because this is a values assumption. Could be disrespectful, and usually they don't. If you tell someone they're wrong, they're not going to listen to you. So we guide this in multiple ways. We start with group rights. Group rights are a huge thing that honestly cover our bums in a lot of situations, where we're giving people the right to participate in these discussions, but we've also given all students the right to pass. So we are not forcing anyone to be in the space. We are allowing them to engage in whatever way fits with their values and beliefs. When we're talking about the right to pass, this is framed very specifically. So mass exodus, people might all leave the space and pass. So I frame it very specifically around discomfort is okay when we're learning, if we're hearing other beliefs that are different from our own. If at any point it's becoming a panic, overwhelmed, scary feeling, and a person is no longer learning because they're in their, lizard brain, the fight or flight freeze brain, then that's the time they can use their right to pass. But in most spaces, we want to try and push through some discomfort so that we can all learn and grow as people and hear perspectives other than our own. And I frame that also with the right to respect as well. We also use the tool of head, heart, body. So head, heart, body is a decision-making tool where we ask someone to check in with their head, their thoughts, feelings, values, their heart, so their feelings and emotions about a decision, and their physical reactions to a decision. So that intuition, the gut feeling, blushing, sweating, all of these things our body does when we're feeling things or thinking things. And because we're saying, here's some information you can add to your head, heart, body, but we're not telling them to make a certain decision, we're never making or forcing people to do anything. So if parents, teachers, students are up in arms about what we're sharing about gender, what we can always fall back on is people have the right to participate and pass and make their own decisions in these spaces. So if you don't want to use some of this information, you don't have to. I'm not forcing this on anyone. Next, we have SEL role modeling, so social and emotional learning. And so a facilitator's job is role modeling how we can hold space for different beliefs. And I do this through our assertive communication tool. So sharing things like, how this makes me feel, what made me feel that way, and what could solve that situation. So a lot of times if we're showing anatomy pictures, for example, and the vulva comes up, and I hear a lot of the men or boys in this space, lots of different comments, a lot of ew, gross, weird, things like that. I share, when I hear comments like weird or gross, that makes me feel really uncomfortable and unsafe in this space, because I'm scared that other people might be judged or ashamed for their values, choices, their bodies. And I think to make this feel better for everyone, could we all try and keep our reactions more respectful in the future? What do you all think about that? And so I'm role modeling how something made me feel, what made me feel that way, and how we can improve it. And so they can see an example of what to do in their relationships when that comes up. This next one, rolling with resistance. So people do generally prefer to keep things the way they know them. Full stop. Yeah. So change, so including new information, especially about gender, is often seen as a threat. So some strategies to roll kind of with this resistance are identifying it, naming it, being like, I feel like the space feels a little bit uncomfortable right now, or I'm seeing that some people disagree with what I'm saying, and that's okay. So we want to normalize it as well. Ooh, I'm pressing buttons. We want to normalize that. Say that's okay to feel different or feel uncomfortable about new things that we haven't imagined for ourselves. Being patient and empathetic, creating a space that allows for discomfort and transformational learning. So don't frame things as scary or negative or that they are wrong. Think about how you would frame a change in your workplace. So those change management strategies that people use, and engage those in how you talk about identity. So be curious in your framing rather than in a way that triggers that defensiveness. And I also always find ways to connect them to the material personally. So especially if there's a lot of male identified folks in the room that are very resistant to talking about gender, I usually lean on talking about gender stereotypes that impact men. And so they can see that actually gender impacts them too in ways that are hard for them. And they're like, oh yes, I have experienced that. And so we can say and relate them to the material, bring them in slowly. And it's a good reminder to consider ourselves the very first person to tell a youth or someone who's showing resistance that there are different ways of knowing than what they've always known. We need to hold empathy for that experience. If they've lived in a bubble their whole lives where all of social media, their parents, everyone around them has told them there's only two genders, and you come into the room and say something different, they're probably going to resist what you're saying. And that's fair. So what ways can we show up empathetically to help plant that seed that maybe later on grows into something where they are more inclusive as an individual? This next one, the pink bubble here, reflection or knowing yourself. So think about, and you don't have to share these, how you came to know the things you know. How long did it take? How long do the youth in front of you have to do that same thing? So have empathy and patience for this process and recognize that that youth might not be ready to transform their beliefs today. Consider how your beliefs and values about this topic are showing up in your facilitation, and whether this balances the power and ideas in the space and makes it feel non-judgmental, accepting, or is it doing the opposite? So is your face showing a lot of disapproval? Are you getting like closed off? Is your voice changing somehow to show them that they're wrong? Because all of those are signals to them that they're going to be more resistant to what you have to say. So doing that check-in, reflecting on how you're showing up, and whether that's conducive to them moving through a really hard transformational learning journey. And then this last one is check in, affirm, clarify, answer. This is a very important tool. So I just talked about the check-in. So that is about reflecting on yourself and how you're showing up in a space. Also considering whether everyone in that space is ready to go deeply into gender ideology conversations, or are they ready to hear just one little tidbit and we move on? We don't need to stand on a soapbox and talk at them about everything they need to know about gender in one space, because that's also going to generate some resistance. So thinking about how much we offer and how much we're showing up in that space. Then we affirm. So thank the group for asking such a great, interesting, common question, whatever it is. This can be very difficult if you hate what they're saying. So a lot of times I'll go, that is such an interesting thought. Or I've heard this from a lot of people. This is a super common idea that's out there right now. And so they're like, yes, I feel heard, seen in whatever way. I clarify. So I make sure I understand exactly what they're saying. I can sometimes turn the question back to the group. In hostile groups, I would not do that because you'll lose control of that space. asking more questions about what the person has learned about this topic, what they mean, rephrasing the question, asking for confirmation. These are all helpful tools to make sure we get to the heart of what they're trying to say. And then the last part here is answer. So providing a general scientific answer. Don't over answer anything or go outside the curriculum that's outlined. And that's huge for partnership management. So for teachers, parents that are all concerned about us being in those spaces, if we go too far outside and go on our own passionate rant about how everyone should feel safe and be included and be amazing in all spaces, which I would love to do, those parents, teachers, everyone will be very angry and not have us back. We are in a long, we're in a long game here. We're playing the long game. And so if we burn those bridges and be too radical in spaces, sometimes that means we get kicked out and none of those youth have that education. So as much as we can, trying to offer the information in a way that they can hear it. And this check and affirm, clarify, answer tool is very helpful for those challenging questions. When we're kind of activated, we breathe, we validate, we answer very briefly, and then check to make sure that's understood. And so there's probably many more micro tips I could share, but I'm going to leave it here and then open up the floor for discussion. So we'll move into the share and solve. So what challenges surrounding gender, relationship, and sexuality education have you encountered? And what tools have you found helpful in overcoming these challenges?